Good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 19th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones and devices as they do affect the broadcasting system. Having said that, some committee members will be consulting their tablets because they have their papers on digital format. We have apologies this morning from Jim Eadie, so can I welcome his substitute, Gil Patterson. Agenda item 1 is a decision to take business in private, and I seek the agreement of the committee to take agenda item 3 in private when the committee will consider its approach to the procurement reform bill. Are members agreed? Thank you. That is agreed. Agenda item 2 is draft budget scrutiny of 2014-15. We will hear evidence from witnesses on the Scottish Government's draft budget 2014-15 as part of the committee's scrutiny process. Today there will be 2 panels, firstly on transport, followed by housing. This year the committee is adopting a different approach. Rather than focusing on specific aspects of the draft budget, the committee will conduct a wider evaluation of the Scottish Government's performance in delivering its priorities as set out in the 2011 spending review in those areas which fall within the committee's remit. So can I now welcome the first panel of witnesses who are Phil Flanders, Director of Scotland and Northern Ireland Road Haulage Association, John Lauder, National Director of Scotland for Sustrans, George Mayer, National Director for Scotland Confederation of Passenger Transport, and Ewan Wallace, who's Chair of the Society of Chief Officers of Transportation in Scotland. Welcome you all, gentlemen. Adam, would you like to start the questioning this morning, please?
Thank you, Convener. Morning, gentlemen. Transport is clearly a significant contributor to the purpose and the purpose targets of the Scottish Government, as well as to a range of national outcomes and national indicators which are contained in the National Performance Framework. Could I ask what your general view is of this framework and how well does transport do in impacting and influencing the measures and targets?
Who'd like to start? Ewan, thank you.
I'm happy to kick off. In terms of the target-based approach is something that all across the member authorities, in terms of Scots, we're very familiar with, and therefore I think that the manner in which this session is to be conducted is entirely appropriate. What we've always found is that by having that target-based approach, it does give a focus in terms of different areas. And certainly having looked at how the budget compares to specific issues such as whether it be road safety, whether it be some of the requirements in terms of increase in physical activity, carbon footprint, and particularly around the modal shift element in terms of trying to increase the number of people using public transport. Generally, when we've looked at the documentation, most of them are either reasonably steady, or there does seem to be a general upward trend in a number of these areas, particularly in terms of addressing the road safety issue. That's something that the member authorities across Scotland have been very active in terms of pursuing, and I think everybody's worked together to a common goal in that respect, and allocated budgets within local authorities as well to reflect the budgetary allocation within Scottish Government and within their agencies. So that's an area that certainly has been very effective over the last certainly 3 to 5 years, if not even longer. Perhaps some of the others are a little bit more flat in terms of the overall progress, but we haven't seen, certainly our interpretation, there's not many of them that are causing major causes of concern, with the possible exception of the carbon footprint one, that we do know that that's a real challenge in terms of how we move forward on that.
I think it's correct that you use performance indicators or the framework to manage and measure the various areas that you've set out in the national framework. I think in general terms the bus industry is trying to give its contribution across the different areas. I suppose the challenge is that at the national level, having a a target for traffic congestion might not always find its way down into the local areas that bus operators have to operate within, because we still see challenges in that particular area. But I think in general terms, without having indicators and measures, you clearly kind of manage the issue as well as you would. So I think it's a good system. I think there is progress being made, but that connectivity to local policies is sometimes questionable.
I suppose what I'm trying to tease out here is the overall purpose of the Scottish Government, as they define it, is to raise the level of sustainable economic growth. Do you think that the way the purpose targets are set out and all the various measures are appropriate for the transport sector, and do you see the transport sector as given an appropriate role to play within that overall purpose? I suppose that's what I'm driving at with the question. I don't know, Phil or John, do you want to comment on that?
I would agree with both the previous speakers in terms of the general comments on it. I think that there are some areas of economic growth which have popped up since the indicators were written and agreed. We know more about in my area, which is walking and cycling, we know more about the income that's now being generated to Scotland from those leisure activities and by people commuting to and from work by bike, which we didn't know when those indicators were written. I think that it might be, if it was possible, they need to be weaved in a bit more. The general comment I would make, which maybe doesn't help to address your question, but the general comment I would make would be, it would be good to see closer collaboration between directorates within government who've got complementary aims and ambitions in relation to transport, particularly between health and transport. Health is predicating the obesity strategy to an extent on people living more active lives, and one of the aims of transport is to have 10% of trips by bike by 2020. But there doesn't seem to be a close collaboration between those two teams within government. Now, there might be, and we're just unaware of it, but I think a more overt and a clearer coming together of those two departments would be very welcome.
We're very happy with the way the targets have been set, and we were very happy to contribute towards those. We could always do with more money, but at the end of the day, we know the constraints, and by having these targets and are measurable, we can hold people to account if they don't deliver. So far, so good.
Okay. Moving on then to capital projects in particular. Obviously, the Scottish Government has an infrastructure investment plan which sets out the medium to long-term capital investment projects across all Scottish Government budgets, as well as a national transport strategy and a strategic transport projects review. Could I ask you, gentlemen, what's your view of the prioritisation of capital projects generally and transport projects in particular within this strategic framework?
We've been very supportive of the government's plans for the new Forth crossing, the dualling of the A9 and 96 and the Aberdeen Ring Road. We know that there are certain other roads that are maybe not up to the high standard that they should be, but the government, I think, needs and have prioritised the roads that they feel are best. There are a lot of concerns regarding the roads to the Western Isles, and we had the incident last week where the road was closed again. So perhaps there should be some money set aside to make sure that that can be kept open and maybe to upgrade it a bit quicker than planned. It's one of these things that you just don't know until it happens, but it's a very important route, the 83, 82, so it's important that we try and keep that one in the best condition that we can.
For our part, I think there's too great an emphasis on investment in roads. I think it's counterproductive to the aim to reduce carbon emissions. and also to tackle congestion. The budget for tackling congestion, particularly within the urban realm, although a lot of that is controlled by local authorities, is constrained. The budget that we manage on behalf of Transport Scotland is very, very small, but the benefit to cost ratios are very, very high of people living more active lives and making short trips by walking and cycling rather than by taking the private motor car. I think that there's an imbalance for our part in the budget. I don't think there's enough investment in infrastructure for walking and cycling, and there's hardly any money at all spent on soft measures, which are just interactions with people, explaining how to use infrastructure and the benefits of walking and cycling more. A tiny, tiny amount of money gets invested in that. So I'm not against investment in roads per se, and I take on board the arguments that Phil would make about particularly remote communities and the necessity to move goods and services. But I think the budget is out of balance. In addition to that, there is no fixed budget for sustainable transport, as I understand it. It's very difficult to work out how much money is being allocated and where from. And where it's clear that there is a budget for rail, for road, that there is no fixed budget for cycling as I can see it. It would be really helpful just to have a line in the budget to say this is how much we're spending. It would really clarify that area. And the evidence that we have from the past few years, and I do take on board that the government have put more money into this area, and I welcome that. So, you know, I want to balance my comments. But on the other hand, the evidence is that there's an appetite out there for more walking and more cycling, and every penny that we give out in a grant to a local authority is matched 50-50, and we're always outbid by local authorities for projects. We've never got enough money to satisfy the appetite. I'm very hopeful that this new announcement that Mr Swinney made and Mr Brown detailed 2 weeks ago at his summit with local authority heads, I'm very hopeful that that too will be outbid as well by local authorities, and we might see more emphasis on how people move around in the urban realm. Whether the urban realm's in a city or whether it's in, you know, a market town in a rural area, it's still an urban realm.
Some of my colleagues will explore the active travel agenda a wee bit later on. George?
I would agree with the points that Phil and John made, in particular to the Forth Crossing and, for example, the FastLink project in Glasgow. But I'm not quite sure, having read through the document, far I can see other investment being channelled towards bus projects. But I see plenty of rail. And you'd maybe expect somebody for the bus industry to say that, but it's difficult to see for the document for the projects that are coming through for bus.
Ewan?
Certainly I agree with the comments from all my colleagues there. And from the Scots perspective, we certainly look at it from, you know, it could be a street, it could be a road, it's the functionality that they bring, and therefore how you feed that into these overall strategic documents that you already mentioned. Yes, the National Transport Strategy, which has been in place for a number of years, you have a clear plan in terms of what you want to see your investment in terms of that infrastructure investment plan from last year. That did bring a degree of prioritisation to the work that was done through the Strategic Transport Projects Review. But I think possibly some of the comments from colleagues would be things that were set out in that strategic review didn't really have particular timescales around them and when they were likely to come forward. It was very much a long-term view, and it was quite strategic in that respect. But even 5 years down the line, four and a bit years down the line from that being adopted, there are some key areas that perhaps could have been earlier or quicker wins. And the one probably, and I'm sure George and others would adhere to this one, you know, park and ride, park and choose strategies. It's something that could have been done in conjunction with a number of regional transport partnerships and local authorities, which may well have had existing funding streams and securing sites. And there's a number of those across the country where they've moved on, but perhaps not at the pace that we could perhaps have seen had we given a focus to it in terms of some of the timescales. Yeah. So and those link then to all the other local initiatives as well, because really, in the public's mind, the local and the strategic network, they're all the same. they will use them to go about their business, and it's about moving the people between the different locations and moving the goods as well. So that's certainly one of the things that we would perhaps like to see a little bit more around in terms of prioritisation. It's then the links back into the town centres review and how that fits into some of these strategic documents as well. And then really looking to get the most effective use out of the funding streams that are available to all of us. I mean, John's made comment about trying to identify as much as possible. I think that obviously falls out of the next stages of the budget process. I think we all keep a very close eye on how much money is available to make sure that we make the best use of it within our own organisations.
Yeah, I think if I could add to that, there is a concern I've got that strategic can sometimes just mean new, as opposed to genuinely what is nationally strategic. Maintenance, for example, is strategic and really important. But Ewan's right. I mean, things move on and new things come along. It might be time to review. I don't know. I don't wish to drag us all into a major review of those.
Well, is there something within the system that requires altered then? Are you suggesting that there's a lack of flexibility, a lack of lightness on your feet, as it were, with regards to this that needs to be addressed?
There could be. I mean, a good example is that at the moment the National Planning Framework 3 is going through, and it's been out for consultation. Now that's taken a view that in our field, the National Cycle Network, the Canal Network and the Long Distance Walking Networks would be national planning priorities. That's happened since we set the strategic transport review. It would be good, I think, to have a quick look at what the strategic transport review was and add it in with what's happening in the National Planning Framework, because the two are kind of leapfrogging each other, but it would be better, I think, if they were brought together.
Yeah, I just say that it's been some years now since the NTS was published, and I seem to recall that there was an intention at a point to do a refresh, but it was deferred. So it might be time time to have a look at it again and take on board some of the things that have changed during that period of time, and also the emerging stuff that's coming through.
Just in terms of your second point about is there something in the system, I think what I would say is the SDPR was a first. It had not really been done before on the scale that it was undertaken, and I think there was a lot of time and effort put in. And ultimately, it was welcomed by everybody, but we always knew it was a start, as opposed to that's it, put it to one side and you move on to only the implementation. I think there'd be a willingness across all the key agencies, those represented here and elsewhere, certainly across the Scots membership in terms of regional and local authorities, that to try and do a bit of work. And you're right, it's a refresh, it's a light touch. We're not saying you're going to spend another 18 months going back in to look at some of the detail of this. And by using the available expertise, you can do that type of thing quickly. A number of the local authorities have done exactly that with their own local transport strategies, which may have taken 12 months to develop the first time round, but when they go back in, it maybe only takes a matter of 3 to 6 months. You've got something that's updated, that reflects the priorities and the reality on the ground.
Okay. As you know, all major transport projects should have a Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance STAG study completed pre-project, plus a strategic environmental assessment. What's your opinion on the STAG and strategic environmental assessment, SEA analysis, as a means of prioritising expenditure within the transport budget? I was too, Ewan, yes.
I would declare an interest at this point because I think in the day job I was certainly involved in using STAG for probably the first time. I wouldn't have said it was necessarily used as a prioritisation of expenditure tool. What it did do is it certainly identified the best options to solve the particular transport issues in that area. And I think that's very much what it's really been utilised for. Interestingly, it has been refined over time since it was originally introduced. So it has gone through that It doesn't need to be quite as cumbersome in some respects. So it's been fine-tuned by the experts who have utilised it. And it's a very effective tool in terms of getting the priorities from the key agencies and the public, in terms of that, the consultative element of it, and the early consultative element undoubtedly is one of the strongest bit. It then brings in the robustness in terms of trying to compare the different modes and what the solutions might be on a corridor basis. So for those big interventions, those things that are identified within the strategic transport projects review, I think is a very effective way of going about it. There is a cut-off point beyond which you wouldn't always then look to apply the same process to the same extent. And I think most local authorities, regional transport partnerships, and to a lesser extent Transport Scotland, do try to be pragmatic in terms of how it's utilised. In terms of strategic environmental assessment, again, we probably across the whole of Scotland have those in place, covering most of the current transport projects that are on the books. So, or they are at least being undertaken. For example, the A96 corridor, I know that's part of the work that's going on at the moment. Therefore, it's a case of if you've got that high-level strategic overview, you still then kick in and have a look at the detailed aspects of an individual environmental impact assessments. And again, SEA process has been refined over the period of time. It's pretty much embedded within the transport professions now in terms of these two types of processes. But I would always say you would always go back and look at them again. And that, I think that's an iterative process. That on the back of every project, you will always identify whether actually was this too heavy-handed, or on the other hand, do we not actually identify some of the things that we should have.
I agree with what Ewan's saying from the technical point of view, that the way that technicians like Ewan would lead their teams through the assessment of projects. I'm just not convinced that the outcome of the appraisal makes much difference. It does seem that big projects take on a life of their own. Once it's been decided that something's going to be built, it's built. I'm not aware of projects being dropped because the outcome of the appraisal was so poor. It seems to me projects go ahead and they take on almost a life of their own, and they happen. So I'm not quite sure that STAG is used strategically to assess what are the best projects and what are the projects that shouldn't be pursued.
Can you give an example of a project where you thought the appraisals were poor and that shouldn't go ahead?
Well, I think when you look at the benefit to cost ratios are quite low on most of the major schemes. So are there other factors that are brought to bear? Can I give an absolute example? No, I can't give you an absolute example.
I was wondering when I was doing the background work on this whether developer contributions are a significant part in some projects. Does that kind of skew the whole process?
In my experience, no, in terms of because it's the point at which those types of financial aspects kick in. And certainly the way that the part of that appraisal guidance that deals with the economics of schemes, there's not that many that I've seen come through the process that would actually build in something like that right from the start. That would be unusual, because you're really almost predicating that on the fact that it will go through the statutory processes and it will be linked to something that might not even be in a local development plan yet. So therefore you wouldn't really have that in it. So it becomes a bit of a windfall at a later point in terms of bringing forward projects. If I can just make one other comment on the back of what John was saying, the one bit you could perhaps look at strengthening within the overall process is some of those softer benefits that John's alluded to in terms of what's the health benefit of putting in an enhanced cycle corridor over a 4-mile stretch between two settlements, for example. And there is emerging work that would identify what those benefits could be in terms of wider society, as opposed to the harder economic benefits that you would use in the STAG process associated with journey time savings, reduced fuel, reduced accidents, those types of things. And that, there's probably a slight weakness there. And by bringing those in, you do then start to balance the differential between different types of project, of transport interventions. There's probably a similar issue in terms of the bus side as well, in terms of what is the value of time for somebody who's using the bus to go about their business. You know, that probably hasn't been updated for a number of years.
In terms of development, again, it was, when we had a housing boom, property development boom, a really good way for schemes, the small schemes that we helped to fund, £500,000 and less. It was a really good way for local authorities to bring in some extra funding. It seems to have almost dried up, but funding is being found from other places. But as Ewan says, it's a kind of bonus. It's an added extra. It's not something that authorities can depend on.
I'm just going to say that I agree with the point that Ewan's made on looking at the wider benefits that some of these projects can deliver. And I think in terms of the bus, there's a growing realisation that, for example, the concessionary travel scheme that allows people to go out and do journeys and meet people and socialise, there has to be an economic benefit to that widely, because even if they're travelling up to Ullapool and having a cup of tea in Ullapool, it's, you know, there's an economic benefit. And I think in terms of refreshing the models, that these things need to be considered and part of the mix.
Mm-hmm.
So following on from John's point, is there evidence that post-project appraisal of economic, social and environmental impacts, you know, particularly of major road projects, is routinely carried out so that it can inform future decision making?
I'm aware that I've certainly not been involved in anything to do with that, but one would hope that if you're spending large sums of money on big projects, that there is an evaluation done, that the benefits have been delivered in the widest possible context. If it's not happening, then I think it certainly should be.
Yeah, I'm not aware of it, but that doesn't mean to say that it isn't happening. I would maybe add to George's point that we are a lot better at monitoring and at making assessments now, and that whole field is improving rapidly. And it might be it's a kind of outpacing what we were talking about before, where things need to be done in a measured way. So policy needs to be reassessed, and it takes time to do that. And at the same time, our ability to monitor the application of the World Health Organization's heat analysis, which is used for small-scale walking and cycling measures, has got better and better. More people do it, they're better at it. We know more about it. So it's one of those things where perhaps the pace is outstripping the policy, and I don't know how easy it is to add that into STAG. I imagine it might take some time, but it would be welcome.
There's a requirement within STAG to go back and do those evaluations. I would have to go back. I'd have to check with colleagues just to see how many have been done. I'm certainly aware that one of the areas in terms of smaller scale schemes where that is routinely done is around road safety. That is the bit where they will go back in and say, and the impact of this was such and such, and this is what the benefit to cost ratio of our interventions were. So that there is a loop that is utilised within the road safety sphere quite routinely. But I would need to check in terms of how many others have been done elsewhere on some of the bigger schemes.
Okay. Mary, do you want to go on to look at some specific national indicators?
Thank you, Convener. Transport has a major role in both climate change targets in reducing emissions and in reducing our carbon footprint. But nevertheless, it's one of a series of policy areas that contribute to that. And a future transport fund is being created to help reduce environmental impacts. And I'm interested in your views on the extent to which these environmental objectives are being strategically managed across all policies, and is the transport budget being deployed in the most appropriate strategic manner to deliver them? Who'd like to start?
I've already said I think the budget's got too great an emphasis on road building, which I think compromises the carbon reduction figure. And I'm going to repeat myself, so I won't. But I think, a modest increase in the budget that goes into walking and cycling and public transport that then levers funds from local authorities on the matched funding principle that we've been running for a number of years is proven to work. It is working, but the jam is spread very thin. So at best, the money that Sustrans manages at the moment on behalf of the Transport Scotland Sustainable Transport Team, it might fund one project in each local authority, maybe more in the larger local authorities. But what that means is that bit by bit, it's kind of turnabout within a local authority. One town might get a project, and then the next year another town will, and another town will. My assessment and the evidence that we've got is that if we had more funds available, more projects would be delivered. Now, I accept that the overall average number of people cycling as recorded by the Scottish Household Survey is very flat at only 2%. But other assessments that we've got and other evidence that we're gathering, and we produced our set of key performance indicators this week. We released them, they're on our website, which is what government uses to assess our performance, shows that there's huge increases within urban centres where you get the right infrastructure in the right place and you promote it properly. And the benefit to cost ratios can be as much as £9.50 to £1 spent, which is a really good return on investment. So I genuinely think, and I mean, I know you could say, well, of course you would say that because that's the area that we're in and we're passionate about. But I do think that if more funding was put available, which needn't necessarily compromise the aim to have a strategic road network, a strategic rail network, would nevertheless provide a benefit in terms of carbon reduction, congestion reduction and improved public health, all of which can be assessed and factored in to the STAG guidance or to the general return that we report. So I do think that more could be done. I also think that there's a health implication simply in encouraging people to be more active and less sedentary. And that also needs to be factored in too. So my general assessment would be that I don't think enough is being done. I think the budget's skewed wrongly.
Anyone else?
I'd agree with a number of the points that John's made. I think from a bus perspective, clearly the industry welcomes the investment the government puts in to assist with the purchase of new greener vehicles. It's hoped that will continue into the future. The dichotomy that there is within that is that the budget line, that part of you have the money to help finance the purchase of the vehicle, and then you have the ongoing running cost. And part of that running cost is bus service operator grant that's paid to the operator. And with a low carbon vehicle, you qualify for a double the rate that prevails. And the danger is if you have a flatline budget, in effect it's a budget cut. And going forward, the attractiveness of investing in new technology diminishes. So we have this dichotomy. On the one hand, we welcome the money that the government puts into buying the vehicle, but in terms of running cost, on an ongoing basis, the budget is reducing in real terms. There is an appetite out there. We used to have the bus route development grant that is part of the Concordat was handed to the local authorities and virtually disappeared. The government have recently introduced a bus investment fund, and it was hugely oversubscribed by partnerships coming forward, local authorities and operators. And it just says to the industry that if there is some money that can be kept at the centre and people have to bid and work to get funding, that people will do it. It doesn't always have to be the case that the money is given to the local authority and then the local authority chooses to spend it on public transport or bus projects. So there's an appetite there. Given the funding, the ideas will come forward and we get growth in bus journeys and the other social and economic benefits that flow for that.
So it's interesting to note in terms of that future transport fund allocation includes electric low carbon vehicles, including buses, freight modal shift, but also a commitment in terms of the cycling and walking initiatives. So there's all of those things, as I said, are probably elements that either operators or individual authorities are already looking at to bring forward with a view to reducing operating costs, but also getting better benefits in terms of their town centres, their city centres, etc. And so there's the fact that it's increasing, I think, from about 7 million up to 18 million plus. That is a significant amount of money, but what we need to maybe get a handle on is how much has been invested within the wider sector as well, off their own back, just to get a sense of just how much is actually going in to try and deal with that. I mean, certainly the bit I would say from the Scots perspective as well, in relation to making sure that the transport network is suitable for cycling and walking, there's also about 490 million spent annually, 500 million thereabouts, on maintaining the existing road network. So that's over and above the dedicated interventions that Sustrans and authorities already put in place, to actually where there's a clear demand for those and to generate more demand. But still, it's the case that across the, I think, 55,000 kilometres of road network across Scotland, people will be cycling, walking, going, driving, using, any type of transport. So therefore, the investment that local authorities and the Trunk Road Authority are making to maintain the existing network and continue to maintain it so it's fit for purpose is a critical element of that sometimes goes unnoticed. And it's back to maybe John's point earlier about it's not just about new, it's about making sure that what you've got already doesn't fall into a state of disrepair so that it puts off people from using the network.
Okay. Phil?
We don't get any funding from government because of state aid regulations, but we do work with the Scottish Government closely on the Freight Best Practice Programme. And going back about 10 years, there was a Scottish Government investment in driver training where we managed to achieve a 10% reduction in fuel consumption. And that has now been rolled out across the industry and is part of the driver CPC. If there was any funding available to help encourage people to do more safe and fuel-efficient driving, it would be very welcome. But overall, the hauliers know there is an issue. They don't want to run around empty. They want to keep everything as tight as possible. Fuel accounts for about 40% of the costs. And when you get about drivers, it's a certificate of professional competence. It's a new legislation that Europe recently brought out that all drivers must have training within a 5-year period.
I mean, in September, the Scottish Government announced its roadmap, which sets out its vision for 2050, when town centres, cities, communities will be free from the damaging effects of petrol and diesel. I mean, do you think it's an achievable target, given the way the budgets are set out, or do you think that there needs to be almost a separate budget allocation to enable hauliers and bus companies and transport people to purchase the vehicles that would achieve that?
I think it would be helpful. If you take the airline industry as an example, the new Dreamliner is the most fuel-efficient and quiet airliner. That technology eventually may well feed down into road vehicles. New technologies are coming along all the time. They say a week's a long time in politics, but 36 years is a long time as far as technology for vehicles is concerned. I would hope by then technology will have advanced enough to allow lorries, even the great big ones, to either be hybrids or electric. It's important that we do try our best for the city centres, and I know that no haulier wants to come into a city centre unless they really, really have to.
Do you think that there's appetite amongst the hauliers to make that almost sea change to those types of vehicles?
The big problem is that the first one that does it won't command extra revenue for the job. If it costs £200 to do a load, that's all he's going to get, because if he puts his price up, they'll give it to somebody else. And no matter how green the customers are, they're finding it tight as well, and always have done, and they tend to go at the lowest price. But see, when you look back over time, as far as vehicle utilisation is concerned, the haulage industry is sitting, I think, about 79%. We'll never get to 100%, because there's certain things that you can't backload. A fuel tanker going out has to come back empty. You can't just put anything else in it. But we're getting better and better at it, and I think Britain or the UK has always led in the logistics industry within Europe. We have the new EU standards coming in at the end of the year, which won't do anything for carbon, but it will reduce the particulates and the NOx. It will come eventually. I wish I had a crystal ball to say what kind of lorries you will have in 40 years. Could be nuclear powered for all I know, but the hauliers are aware and they're demand led. If somebody asks for something, the hauliers will do it, and the manufacturers are looking at different types of power, the dual fuel, pure gas, battery, and as technology moves on, it will come.
I think the bus industry as well, you know, fuel is a major element, of course, that the operators are faced with, and already operators are enhancing different technologies to improve the performance of the bus fleet. And that, some of that comes along with help from the Scottish Government. And I think if we are to aspire to that kind of targets, I think you'll only ever achieve them if we work together as an industry and government and local authorities. You know, there'll be significant reductions in emissions if we could get traffic moving in city centres without doing anything to existing technology. But you know, you have projects in Scotland that again help through Scottish Government. Stagecoach, for example, have the vast majority of their fleet on biofuel that's producing better emissions than pre-moving to bio. We've got potential for gas projects. I think the industry is up for looking at different technologies and performing better and can deliver, as we've seen in certain other areas of the country, there's a need to meet air quality requirements. But I think to get there and do it in the kind of timescales that have been mentioned, you'll only achieve that if you work together.
Ewan, do you have any further comments on that?
Well, the only one would be certainly in terms of that alternative fuel technology, whether it be rolling out of electric vehicles, looking at hydrogen, looking at gas power, look at whatever that may well be. There's a number of projects all across Scotland, UK, Europe and beyond where there's a lot of very, very good best practice. And there's clearly something there whereby I think individual local authorities have perhaps tapped into that. I know that there's maybe been some element of work by Scottish Government. There is a coordination role here that's absolutely crucial to make sure that we don't land up in a VHS Betamax type situation in terms of technology. That a lot, because it's public money, you could land up investing an awful lot in, backing the wrong horse in some respects. So therefore, there's a bit of work there, I think, for all of the constituent authorities who are involved in this to try and move forward. The detail of what was involved in publishing that roadmap, I was heavily involved on behalf of Scots to get that to the stage it was. It's then been delivered locally all across the country. Individual authorities are putting in additional charging points. But ultimately, further down the line, we'll have to see then where the costs associated with running the vehicles, replacing battery packs, the whole life costs then start to kick in. So we'll have to build those into budgets in future years as well to allow for that.
Yeah, it can't be a one-off, it has
absolutely.
to be a sustained
Absolutely.
over the years. Okay. Can I ask you a bit more about journeys to work by public or active transport? Because the national indicator that reflects that is flat. And there has been some additional funding allocated across the next 2 years to cycling, and we have touched on that in our previous answers. But do you think the interventions being pursued are wrong? And is the investment in the right place? And are the public, private and third sectors all engaged? And I'd also be interested in your views on how behaviour change affects how people travel. And is enough notice being made of behaviour change, and should more be done to affect behaviour change?
Well, how long have you got? Not long, so I'll try and be as concise as I can. In terms of behaviour change, which is the softer side of putting down infrastructure, I've already made the point that I think there's not enough revenue money available to fund things like on-road training for primary school children, The bikeability training is very good. It's a volunteer model. It works very well where it works, but it's underfunded, and I think more funds could be put into it, and I think there would be a big benefit to cost ratio of that. In addition, workplace travel planning is a very cheap behaviour change. It's always effective in terms of just engagement with people within the workplace. I don't think employers do enough. I think the 2020 Climate Group could do more. I would like to see them sign up to the Cycling Action Plan for Scotland, for example, which has 10% of trips as its vision by 2020 by bike. Where we're working at the moment with the Royal Bank of Scotland and their team at Goggerburn at their HQ, but now rolling this out right across Royal Bank, we've got a very, very good initiative, which is a very, very simple, low-level thing to do, which is simply about taking people who are enthusiastic about cycling anyway and giving them some additional training, a minimal amount, but additional training so that they become the go-to person within the workplace. It's so much easier if somebody you work with knows what they're talking about, they know the routes in and out of the office, they can make recommendations about clothing and equipment and that type of thing. It's much better talking to somebody that you work with than it is about a third party who comes in that you don't really know. And again, a very, very low level investment, and the Royal Bank are putting money into that, they're match funding it. So again, that's really, really good. And even in those countries like Scotland, small Northern European countries who've got a very high modal share, they do put money into behaviour change, particularly around the journey to school. They all, even in Holland, bigger country, huge modal share for cycling, but they still put funding into training and funding into engagement with parents so that parents are confident that children have got the right abilities to get out and about. In terms of commuting, we know that on the National Cycle Network about a quarter of the trips are by people who are travelling to work. There's evidence within Edinburgh from the City of Edinburgh's own Cordon counts that about 7% of trips to work are by bike. So there are some hotspots in Scotland and some good examples. And I think that other local authorities can learn from Edinburgh's Active Travel Action Plan, which is a really good plan, very simple model, but a very effective one. Again, it goes back to a combination of funding, what's available. The more funding that's available, the more will entice local government officers like Ewan to do more. And also, the more we do that, the more engaged elected members become. And I think that when that happens, what we tend to find is that elected members grow in confidence that this is actually a wise investment. Because there's a caution about putting money into cycling. It is seen as slightly elite. It is seen as perhaps a bit difficult in Scotland, where we've got challenging weather and challenging topography. But those things are not the issue that people think they are. And once we break through that barrier, you tend to find that elected members become much more enthusiastic about it.
Do you think that the issue of behaviour change and the change that behaviour change has on targets is almost a kind of drip effect? It's not a sudden change. You don't see an immediate effect on a target because of behaviour change. And because it is a long-term change, do you think that's one of the reasons that not enough focus is put on it?
I think it's an issue, and I've spoken to other elected members before who've said, it's all very well, John, that you talk about a benefit to cost ratio for health, but that's years down the line. We're in a tight spot. Where are we financially? And I take that argument on board. I can only think that in terms of preventative spend, it makes a great deal of sense. And in terms of the very modest amount of money that can be put in compared to the really good benefits that can be generated. So, for example, a small scheme that we've monitored in Linlithgow cost £150,000 to build. It's had huge benefits in terms of health, but also just in terms of people getting around, reducing congestion. We also know that the National Cycle Network is generating something like 160 million a year in spending. And that's by people, not by visitors necessarily to Scotland, it's by Scots themselves just going out and about, spending a bit of money, doing up their bike, buying some new kit, maybe staying overnight somewhere on a longer trip. Now, our budget of investment into the National Cycle Network is something around about £1 million a year. Now, that's probably matched by local authorities to the tune of maybe £2 million a year. So for a £2 million spend, people are spending about £160 million a year. That's cash. That's genuine revenue. So that, I think, again, is a good benefit. But in terms of the behaviour change, I do agree with you. I think it's a slow burn. That's why it's maybe unattractive, but it's a sensible investment.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there was a piece of work done by Transport Scotland a year or so ago back that looked at different projects in different areas of Scotland for the informed people with the choices that they had to how they could travel. And I think the clear answer to that project was that it works, and it can be a slow build-up, but it does actually work. I think back in time there was a project Choose Another Way. Again, that was a chunk of money that was put in, and the outcomes for that piece of work demonstrated that you can change people's perceptions and habits. I also think that we're probably at a tipping point that people now far better understand the issues to do with climate and emissions and air quality than perhaps 5 years ago. So people are more receptive, and some bus companies have built on that principle in different parts of the country, for they've used briefing sessions and direct targeting people to get them, encourage them to use the bus. So I think it can work, it needs to be sustained, and it will grow over time. In terms of the budget, I'd have to say, again, you'd probably expect somebody from bus to say this, that when you look at the budget for transport, there's 66% of the budget targeted on 17% of the journeys. To me, that seems totally wrong. Bus is by far and away 84% of the journeys, public transport journeys, are made by bus, but we get 16 or 17% of the budget. There's something inequitable about it, and there's bags of research that tells you that you, across a range of indicators, PTEG did a good piece of work recently that demonstrated that in concessionary journeys you get 1.5 times for every one that you spend. In social, in economic, 2.5 times the one you invest. So encouraging greater use of the bus in local communities delivers, but the whole setup of the budget looks somewhat wrong.
Direction almost.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, the only comments I would add was around one of the things that John picked up on, and the role of the private sector in terms of encouraging a shift to, I suppose, more efficient and more active forms of travel, or even indeed travelling less. And that's a critical aspect. That's one of the areas where, by making the case to the businesses of what they can achieve for their employees, by making them healthier, by making them, giving them more time, I suppose, on their journey to and from the workplace in a less stressful environment. So therefore, there's work that has been done in the past, but again, it is constrained in terms of the amount of budgets that's allocated by individual authorities for these types of work. It's something that regional transport partnerships are very strong on and want to try and do more on, and I would certainly support more being done in terms of targeting the private sector in terms of what they can actually bring, both in terms of support in kind and support in cash, in terms of a very effective intervention. So.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks. Gordon?
Thanks, Convener. Ewan, you mentioned earlier on that road safety improvements had been very good over a long number of years, and part of that might be down to the cost-benefit analysis that takes place after every project, if I picked you up correctly. Is that a model that could be used for other national indicators where it's either flatlining or worsening? And are there any other distinguishing features about them that could be addressed in achieving other national indicators?
Certainly, it is transferable. It's something that I think is already being a similar approach is used in other areas. The issue around the road safety interventions tends to be that cause and effect are very closely aligned, and therefore the evaluation process is more straightforward. This was the issue, this is what we've done, and this is the impact it's had. I think across most of the other elements that we're talking about, the decision made by an individual as to what mode of transport they're going to use, when they're going to make the journey, and whether they're going to travel at all is a degree more complex than perhaps is undertaken in terms of the road safety side. But it doesn't mean to say that you can't do it. I'm aware that through various research establishments, that's the type of approach they want to try and take, to break down that decision-making process so you can intervene through behaviour change, through infrastructure improvements, to then say, well, that's why this is a better way of travelling, and therefore doing that. So it is already being replicated. It's just that the road safety side is very, very, very precise in terms of what you're able to identify. So.
I think it's. I think it could and should be used in other areas. You know, we recently commissioned work to look at what we term as generalised time. So it's the time that it takes to complete a journey for somebody that wants to travel. And if you have the actual car journey time versus the bus time, and you look at building, walking and such like, you can build up a generalised model and then start to look at that parts of the model that need to be addressed to make the bus journey more attractive than the car. So using that kind of information and building up a model seems hugely sensible in terms of how you look at the balance of does somebody walk, use the car, take the bus, and if they have to take the car or bus, how do you make the bus journey more attractive?
I'm not sure if it's answering your question, Mr MacDonald, but following on from what George has said, there's a lot of things we don't know enough about. And within transport, I think we're beginning to learn things about behaviour change, why people make changes. But I genuinely don't think we do know enough. And I think if I was to make a plea, it might be that more was invested in research into the softer side of, as George is saying, why people make journeys, how do you entice them to consider what's the appropriate mechanism for making the journey and at what time. I think we are making a lot of decisions on assumptions, and that's dangerous. So that would be my encouragement. And the reason for me mentioning that is that, you know, in terms of road safety, obviously that's a really tender point for us at the moment, because we've had a number of deaths of cyclists this year already, and we really don't know enough about why we're having this increase in deaths. I think some research would really be valuable to work out why are the reasons that we've seen this increase. Is it that there are just more people out on their bikes? If that's true, then why is the figure, the national figure, so low? Why is it stagnant? You know that. So there's something we need to know a little bit more about there. So that would be one plea I would make in terms of road safety.
As far as behaviour change in the haulage industry goes, Road Haulage Association and a number of the hauliers do support rail freight, but it's not the easiest thing to do, but it's something that we're not going to give up on. The road safety element, all lorry drivers are well aware of the dangers of the road, particularly for pedestrians and cyclists. And it's not so much behaviour change, it's trying to make sure that people don't lose concentration at critical times, I think. And I know that the A9 safety group are looking at some of these issues anyway, on more general incidents on the road. Mm-hmm. But we would be more than supportive of looking at how to stop people losing their concentration, particularly in town centres, and particularly where there's pedestrians or vulnerable road users around.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the other subjects we've talked about is reducing traffic congestion, and the government has already indicated that it wants to connect regions and people to increase economic opportunity. Given that 1 in 10 journeys are affected by congestion, could improvements to the road system that are taking place at the moment actually, to improve this connectivity, have an adverse impact on congestion and emissions? for instance, I'm thinking about I know the Aberdeen ring road will bring a great improvement to Aberdeen itself, but if we think about the situation in Edinburgh to the west of the city, the housing budget is to build 107,000 homes by 2024 in the west of the city, and that is across 6 council areas. West Lothian's to build 20,000 units. Most of that will be commuter traffic through the 4 main arteries from the west of the city. I mean, you know, how do we get that balance right? You know, has the national indicator to reduce traffic congestion and the budget actually the right strategic approach, bearing in mind we've got this housing and transport situation?
Ewan's probably more an expert in the Western Peripheral route than I am, but it strikes me that you need to ensure with that kind of project that any benefits that are gained within the city in terms of road space are used to the best effect for public transport and people that have to use the bus. If you simply just let things flow on, it's inevitable that traffic will fill up. So I think it has to be, yeah, as you know, Western Peripheral route will be good, but I think you also have to look at how you deal with the road space that's freed up in the city, and for me that should be prioritised on public transport. And I think if you are, you know, we want to see development and we want to see new businesses and new homes being built. Why would we want that? I think it's about how you deal with the planning and the access and the transport links, and they need to be a high consideration at the very outset rather than an afterthought.
Yeah.
So would that be like the introduction of bus lanes within the cities?
Yeah, I think you know, there's huge benefits, and again, you'd expect somebody from buses to say that, but we have to think of the people on the bus. And if you are going to convince people that are sat in cars, it's hugely effective if you are in a queue and the bus gets to the head of the queue. A, to keep existing customers, but secondly, to grow it. And it, you know, it links back into park and ride. So you'd be looking at all these different options. But I think greater priority has to be put on public transport and getting people moving on buses. And there are huge benefits to doing that in terms of reducing congestion for those that have to use the car, reducing, you know, I want 1% reduction in car journeys would increase bus usage by something like 12%. Mm-hmm. So how many cars do you get off the road? Less emissions. Footfall to shops, I think in most urban areas the footfall arriving by buses in the region of 35 to 40%. Mm-hmm. So if you can get these things up, get more people on the bus, there's ones across a whole range of measures. You know, the bus is a business.
I'd add to that by saying it is a big concern if we are kind of predicating housing development on people driving for every trip. There's nothing wrong with having a car, and I think we don't need to look very far to other countries where there's a higher ownership of the car, yet there's a higher take-up of public transport and of walking and cycling. And, you know, for example, in Denmark and in Norway, most cycle trips are to a public transport interchange. They're not place to place. Most of those trips are simply, I'm going to town, I'm going to take the bus, I'm going to cycle to the bus. Or there's a quicker bus 2 miles away and there's a stop, I'll cycle there. I'll leave my bike, I'll get the bus, I'll come back, my bike will be there and I'll go home again. Or I'll take the train. And I don't think we're at that level of planning yet in Scotland. It's slightly worrying that we're not. We've got Designing Streets, which is an excellent policy for how the urban realm should look and be built. So those new houses will be built to Designing Street standards, hopefully, which will make them very nice to live in. They'll be less predicated on cul-de-sacs and big drives for 2 or 3 cars per household. But if at the same time we are not thinking about, well, how do we improve the public transport system so that people don't need to make that regular daily grind, which for a lot of people in cars is just quite boring, really, and not much fun, and it's not great for their car either. But there's a combination there of also with employers not necessarily having vast car parks surrounding their places of employment and spending a bit of time with their staff, just planning and advertising what the options are for taking public transport, so that we don't need to think that, well, if one of the big worries about the Aberdeen Western Peripheral is that it will create lots of housing development along it, and that will increase in congestion. There's maybe nothing wrong with building houses along the route of the Aberdeen Western Peripheral bypass if people access the city by public transport. That would be the approach that would be taken in Germany or smaller Northern European countries. They would already have planned the bus route. They would already have planned the bus stop. They might have put in light rail. Dare I mention trams? But you know, they would have thought that. They would have thought that through, and it would be going down as the houses are built. It would be part of the road's structure, and I don't see why we can't do that in Scotland. I really don't understand why we can't do that. But as a combination of things there, and it's going back to your question about engagement with employers, and in terms of their behaviour change, it did occur to me that many employers are in the business of behaviour change. They make you buy things that you don't necessarily need, but you buy them anyway, so they're pretty good at changing our behaviour. So I think an engagement there would be very powerful, and it would add to uptake of public transport.
For me, there's perhaps two levels to the question. Firstly, there's that impact on the strategic network and how that's built in terms of the planning of the major projects, whether it be Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, M74, M80s, A9 and A96 going forward, and how that's allowed for in terms of, I'll go back to strategic park and ride, park and choose type approaches to try and give that opportunity to interchange with bus and other, and cycle, etc. Then you get down to the more detailed role of ourselves as planning authorities and roads/transport authorities, and making sure that we do design in a lot of the best practice that we have. And certainly through Scots, we're currently updating the roads developer guides for all local authorities across Scotland to utilise on a pan-Scotland basis. Yes, there'll be subtle variations in terms of different areas, in terms of materials that are used that are more appropriate for different parts of the country, but in essence that will reflect the designing streets methodology, which is more about people than vehicles. It's more about making the linkages in terms of the cycle network and the public transport network. It's then how that's translated into a local development plan process that allows you to then put in planning conditions on large-scale developments and say, well, actually, for the next 5 years, you are going to upfront fund the public transport provision for the whole of that development as it comes on stream. And at the end of that 5 years, it will then be something for the local authorities to consider, is that washing its face? Do you still need to support it? But is it commercial? And all of a sudden, because there's a market there for the private operators. So it's linked, and all those things are being linked together in terms of at the local level. But there will always be a bit of a lag in terms of where you are. To have the all singing, all dancing integrated network when the first few houses are being constructed, there's just a degree of patience, I suppose, required to build into the process that it will happen and has happened in different locations. But then we have to then look at some of we've talked about the bus investment fund. Those types of things are probably the best use of that funding is to go back in and try and sort the issues where we haven't dealt with them in the past, and being able to put in infrastructure and additional services that allow us to get a shift in terms of the type of transport that's being utilised.
I think if you have park and rides further out of towns, where, say, somewhere in the Bathgate area, because if you from Livingston in, that's where a lot of the queues start coming in, and that's where everybody gets held up. If you had more ferry toll type style park and rides, where 2 or 3 different bus routes come in, then that would be very beneficial. If you look over in Glasgow at where the Eurocentral development's been, there's huge areas out there that would work. And if you can get more cars off the road, it leaves more space for the road users that have to be there, that don't have a choice. and I think people would relish that. And some of the developments that the buses and trains have been talking about, introduction of Wi-Fi and whatever else, all these things will help encourage people out of the cars. Because you can't really be texting when you're driving, but you can when you're on a bus. So we would support that as well.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, Mark?
Thank you, Convener. Most of the capital expenditure on transport projects will have an impact on the revenue budget in future years for maintenance costs. Just to ask you whether you think there's been enough consideration to the future maintenance cost for a lot of the projects that are in the government's infrastructure investment plan.
Start in terms of, I suppose, the built infrastructure element. There's been a significant amount of work done between ourselves as representatives of the local authorities and Transport Scotland around road maintenance and improving best practice and looking at what the backlog calculations are in terms of how much work is currently outstanding, but also to build in a way of getting the best possible bang for your buck going forward in terms of the amount of money. I think certainly that there is more has clearly been allocated in terms of the trunk road network going forward, certainly over the next 2 or 3 years. And we've seen that looking back over the last couple of years as well, that there is more going into maintaining the road network as such. In terms of local authority side, what we have seen on the back of the joint work that we have done is certainly between 10 and 12 local authorities that have put additional funding into road maintenance because of some of the work that we'd undertaken. I mean, there was a particular bit of research which identified the wider benefits of making sure you have a well-maintained road network, which showed that if for every pound you invest in, you're getting about £1.50 wider benefits. So that hadn't been done before. So it made the case perhaps more strongly than we had in the past. So therefore, I think there's still an issue in terms of the condition of the network overall. It's probably on around about 68% of the network is in good condition, but there are clearly areas which you will all be very well aware of, probably in your own constituencies, where you do need to invest a little bit more going forward. It's about the long term as much as anything, which I know is very difficult for you in terms of the periods that you have to work within in terms of your budgetary allocations. But that's the message that collectively across the industry we're trying to say, you're in here for the long haul in terms of to try and make the changes in terms of the long-term maintenance. In terms of then the capital projects and the impact that has, I know certainly that will be allocated in future years. There'll be a mechanism by which that will be reflected back in terms of your own budget, and that happens within local authorities as well. You can't take forward any sort of capital transport project without giving due consideration to the revenue implications. You have a very long and detailed discussion with your finance colleagues in your individual local authority about that, and you have to then build that into the future in whatever form that may take. And I say that's capital in terms of construction. There's also then different elements in terms of the revenue aspects of wider transport. I mean, that's maybe touching into the bus area as well, that maybe George would want to come in on.
I could make two very short points about maintenance. One is that the great thing with maintenance is that it involves people working all across Scotland. So an emphasis on maintaining roads is a good thing, because it's low. It can be low level, and it can be, rather than concentrating on one or two big projects, maintenance is about all roads, and therefore it affects all areas, particularly more remote and rural areas as well. The second thing is that, and it may be out with the scope of your discussions, but I think it's worth noting, is that I don't think enough emphasis is given to maintaining footways and pavements for people who are walking in the urban realm. And it is the case that in most local authorities, claims against them for trips and spills on footways are far higher than damage to vehicles on the road network. I just think that's worth noting and reflecting on.
If I can just come back to the specific projects in the infrastructure investment plan. We spoke about the maintenance costs as we go on. The Cabinet Secretary has introduced a 5% cap on revenue costs associated with borrowing, and that will apply to a lot of the projects related to transport through the NPD and regulated asset-based borrowing. Do you think there should also, associated with the 5% cap on borrowing costs, that a similar measure should be considered in terms of maintenance costs of these projects as well?
Well, I think that would make it very, very difficult in terms of some of those larger scale projects. You're kind of putting off the fateful day, because if you're building something brand new, I'll take an example of a road, you'd be looking to build something in around about year 15 in terms of between year 15 and year 20 in terms of substantial resurfacing, and that's not going to be cheap. So that could certainly breach that type of cap. Without really going into some of the detailed figures, it would be difficult to say whether that would be possible. But that type of thing, for example, if it's that not-for-profit type approach, NPD approach for a major scheme, any consortium that's coming forward to build a new road scheme will be doing that calculation, because they know if they're in for the 30-year maintenance of any new piece of infrastructure, they will have to build that in. And 30 years is an interesting one, because generally you're talking 20-year, you want to be resurfacing a major piece of road infrastructure. So they have to build that into their business case. So it's really in terms of how that relates back to what we do within our own authorities and how we build it in. We certainly don't set ourselves that particular cap. So.
I'm less qualified to comment on some of the things that Ewan has touched on. I mean, I think that the worrying factor for me is that it may well be, given the constraints that the Scottish Government have got on finance, that you can understand that it's going to have to be give and take in some areas. But the underlying impact of less revenue being available, could see perhaps some of the more rural areas losing bus services and things because money has to go in other areas. So there's big risks there, but given the major constraints that the government have got on them in terms of managing the wider issues, it's not a task that I would envy. But there are risks.
Yeah, I would defer to Ewan's expertise on that particular area. But I think this goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that strategic is not necessarily new. Strategic is also about things like maintenance. And I am a little concerned that in terms of when we look at strategic projects, we are thinking about big new things, as opposed to genuinely strategic, which would be elevating the condition of the existing network. So maintenance is a big concern. It really is.
Yeah, maintenance is concerning for the haulage industry too. And if there was a way of having more preventative maintenance, rather than letting the roads deteriorate where it's going to cost 3 times as much next year as if you fixed it this year. There's lots of examples of that throughout Scotland, I'm told. It's important we keep the network up to a reasonable standard to allow the free movement of people and goods. Lots of places have got a small pothole that develops into a big pothole, which then affects the cyclists and trucks. A broken spring in a lorry could cost you a few £100. New tyre on a car or a bus, anything from £100 to £500. Cyclist, it could be a matter of life or death. And it's important that we bear that in mind.
Okay, and Gil.
Thanks very much, Convener. Many of the national indicators and all the purpose targets require Scottish Government agencies to align their budgets and activity through joint working, which often extends to the private and third sector delivery partners. To what extent do witnesses feel cross and joint working within the public sector happens, and are non-public sector partners fully engaged in the process of target setting and strategic planning?
From our experience, it seems to work quite well. We've been in various groups with Transport Scotland and BEAR or AMI, and from our opinion, in the main, it works quite well. on say new projects, and it's maybe not totally relevant, but I want to raise it anyway. The government commitment to pay the contractor promptly only counts towards the first contractor. By the time you get all the way down to the haulier, sometimes they're waiting 4 months to be paid. Sometimes they don't get paid at all. I think maybe when we're looking at new contracts, we need to look that the primary contractor has to make a commitment all the way down the line. We've seen it on not just on roads, but 1 or 2 of the windmill sites where the hauliers have had to wait quite substantial periods of time, and 1 or 2 haven't been paid at all yet. So that could well be a big issue.
Come up when we can look at the procurement bill.
I would say on a bus point of view, I think we have relatively good engagement with Transport Scotland, both in terms of policy and operational issues. We participate in a number of working parties and groups, and we have a good, healthy dialogue. We might not always agree, but that is just like a good marriage, I suppose. But good engagement, and I think it's been extremely helpful in dealing with issues through these difficult and challenging times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo that. I think the engagement with Transport Scotland is really good. The Minister, Keith Brown, held a summit 2 weeks ago around the Cycling Action Plan. It was really a really good meeting. He brought together all the important players within transport, within local authorities, and some statutory agencies as well. And it was genuinely good, and really pleased to see it happening. And I hope that it will be an annual event, and that's really, really good. Where I think a bit more could be done, as I mentioned before, is I don't see, and that doesn't mean it's not happening, but I don't see clear engagement between the people who generate lots of short trips in terms of health and education with the people who have to deal with those short trips. Transport, both at the local and at the national level. A lot of congestion is created around the school run. A lot of congestion is also created around the major hospitals as well, where you've got people both visiting and working. So I think that more could be done to bring those agencies together in a coherent way. But like George, I'm really quite heartened by where we are at the moment.
Can I just add to my previous comments? The Minister also set up a bus stakeholder group where we have a range of different bodies that participate in regular meetings and look at bus issues going forward. And through that there will be undoubtedly things that will drive policy change, improvements in quality and various other things. So across the spectrum we work with government, we work with Transport Scotland. I'd like to see more engagement at local authority level. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. In certain parts, there are some exceptions for it. It's particularly good. But in general terms, I think the engagement's quite good.
I think for that question is engagement's all very well, but its influence is the main factor, I think, when engagement takes place. And I wonder, with your experience, of what benefit does engagement allow you to influence? Have you anything you can bring to the table, so that you were talking about the local authorities, to encourage them that there is a benefit in engagement? Not only are you able to influence, but I wonder if it's a reverse process also.
I think there are some good examples around Scotland. Aberdeenshire work very, very closely with the operators in their part of the world, with a formalised partnership arrangement. In other areas, we have formalised partnership arrangements, and I guess I'd like to see a lot more of that. For there's joint working on how bus services are delivered, the quality aspects, the frequency, the whole range of factors. And the more of that work you can be delivering on, the far better the chances are that things will improve, and improve quicker than they would under normal circumstances. I think the engagement with Transport Scotland is really good. We work jointly to monitor things like the concessionary travel scheme, BSOG, in-year performance against the budget and so on. And I think that's extremely healthy. And we exchange views and positions, and it helps drive, you know, the changes that have happened. They've been painful, but we've been part of that process and come to the end of it and understood where we've been and where we've arrived. And I think that's, you know, I think that's to be commended.
I'm conscious that we're slightly over time, convener. So, apart from wanting to thank George for this kind comments about the home team, the two levels from our perspective in terms of Scots on this one. The engagement undoubtedly with Scottish Government and their agencies, Transport Scotland and numerous other parts is generally very strong. Some really excellent work around the road maintenance review over the last 18 months. It's now pretty much embedded. Excellent direct contacts made between the different parts of local authorities and Scottish Government on that. The pan-public sector work then through community planning partnerships and through NHS is evolving, I think would be the best way of putting it. Undoubtedly, from the Scots perspective, all of the heads of transportation or roads within local authorities now have quite broad remits. And undoubtedly we all pitch up at various different forums with representatives from all of these groups and many others as well. The health and social care agenda is the new one on the block, and will undoubtedly start to try and tackle some of the issues that we've discussed here already, because transport and health is undoubtedly one of the ones that is very much a focus for a number of the authorities all across Scotland. So I think it's very strong in terms of what we're doing. There's lots of debate, discussion going on. The bit when it sometimes becomes more difficult for as local authorities is often we'll end up being the focal point for a number of different parts of the Scottish Government budget. So it's quite likely if this budget, you know, if and when this goes through, that the same parts of individual authorities will be dealing with electric vehicles, the bus investment fund, talking to John in terms of the Sustrans allocation of funding, working through fate forums, etc., etc., etc. And that, so there is an issue in terms of sometimes in terms of capacity, but that's part of what we as Scots try to help the member authorities through as well, to share the knowledge across the group.
Okay, I think that's a good point on which to end. And can I thank you all, gentlemen, very much for your contributions today. That will certainly inform our report. Thanks. Can I suspend the meeting briefly to allow the witnesses to leave the room and the new ones to come in? Okay, if we can move swiftly on. I now welcome the second panel of witnesses. We have David Bookbinder, Head of Policy and Public Affairs from the Chartered Institute of Housing in Scotland, Professor Kenneth Gibb, Professor in Housing Economics, Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow, Jim Hayton, Policy Manager from Alacho, and Susan Torrance, Policy Manager from the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Mary, would you like to start this session, please?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. The link between expenditure on housing and GDP growth, other than the multiplier effect, is probably more indirect than direct. Housing is clearly a requirement for economic activity and growth, but the correlation might not always be clear. So, do witnesses, what's your view on the purpose and its targets in the housing area, and how useful do you find the National Performance Framework?
Susan.
Not terribly useful, if I'm honest. In reading through the National Performance Framework and the indicators directly relevant to housing, the improving access to suitable housing options for those in housing need, which I think is measured by looking at homelessness statistics, which in itself is obviously one indicator, but I think misses out on the huge amount of need that is met through the work of associations and councils in terms of social housing. Older people, people with disabilities, people who don't even get anywhere near the homelessness figures as such, all of that benefit is missed by that as a crude indicator. And increasing the number of new homes, again, while that's a net increase, hopefully, every year, again, it misses out on the proportion of social houses built, although, I mean, one thing I think we've always been conscious of is something I think that the committee highlighted last year, which is drilling down into housing statistics and housing figures and how difficult it was sometimes to actually work out whether targets were being met or how the programme was progressing. And again, as I say, the simple high-level increase in the number of new homes doesn't really give us an awful lot to go on to get back to your original question, which was about its contribution to GDP and growth. So that's my view. I don't know what other people think.
Speaking from the local authority side, the housing side and local authorities, I think the view there would be pretty similar. I doubt that people dig out the framework on a regular basis and check it. I mean, all of us would frequently and do frequently make the case about the importance of housing and the multiplier effects that it does have in terms of creating employment and training opportunities for people, increasing GDP. We point out the role that good housing can play in early years in helping our children's attainment and education. We point out, indeed pointed out in evidence to the Health and Sport Committee a couple of weeks ago, about the importance that housing can play in preventative spending and improving outcomes in the health and social care area. But it's very difficult, and I think we accept that, to absolutely establish that cause and effect. So we continue to make the case and we continue to point out the links, but I think we could and we should get a bit better at making these links absolutely copper-bottomed and getting them into the public domain.
So do you think government should pay more attention to the impact that housing has on the things that you've mentioned, which are health? I mean, it can kickstart the economy, but housing also has an effect on health, well-being, employment, so many other things, that it should be given a more strategically important part in the budget?
Yes, yeah, I would certainly argue that, and I think my colleagues may too.
I'd like to turn the thing on its head a little bit, because I think for me the issue is the extent to which the housing sector as a whole contributes to the long-term growth of the economy. So it's not so much necessarily about individual budget items, but the contribution housing makes to help investment more generally. You know, if there's houses in the right places, that can encourage investment in the right places. Does the private rented sector allow flexibility in the labour market? Those sorts of things. Are house prices and rents stable? Are they, you know, in a sense, following the general rate of inflation rather than being speculative or volatile? That instability is bad for the economy. If house prices are rising rapidly, that leads to disturbance in consumption expenditure, which through equity withdrawal and things like that, distorts the economy. So there's a much broader sense in which the housing system matters to how the economy functions. And it's not simply about, important as the budget is, it's not just about the budget.
David, do you have any?
No, I mean, I think that I echo the comments of colleagues on the performance framework. It is a very general framework. Housing's not outlined in great detail, and therefore we tend to measure the Scottish Government's certainly housing supply performance against its housing supply pledges rather than per se the National Performance Framework.
So if you could influence some change in how the National Performance Framework is set out, what changes would you like to see that would be beneficial to you then? In
a sense of being able to, as was alluded to a minute or two ago, a sense of being able to better measure the impact that housing has on other areas. I mean, there's lots of models around about measuring, for every pound that's spent on housing. Obviously there's the economic, the employment multiplier, but health and education outcomes are obviously more difficult to measure in absolute terms. So if there were better ways of measuring those other outcomes, if you like.
Do any of the other panel members have any other views on that?
Just to echo that point, I think just about making the relationships more explicit. I think there's a kind of assumption that if things in general appear to be heading in the right direction, if the economy is growing, if educational attainment is going well, if crime is coming down, then we tend to assume that we're kind of doing something right. But I think maybe making the relationships between housing expenditure, housing investment, and those other important indicators as well, just a bit more explicit, a bit more transparent, and a bit more easy for ourselves and others to get a handle on. I think that would be a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
I don't actually sit on the Housing and Regeneration Housing Policy Advisory Group, but my colleague did pass, I think, some good work that they've been doing on kind of drilling down into the National Performance Framework and specifically linking housing outcomes to policy and also the National Performance Framework. So I was quite interested in how that was eventually going to be translated into the framework, if you like, because, as I say, I think there's been some good work done on specific outcomes and specific targets, but obviously it's a much lower level than the committee would want to consider in terms of looking at the budget.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Angill.
Convener, Scotland Performance web pages don't carry many comments about the need for quality housing to promote participation, enhance cohesion or solidarity and boost productivity. Could and should they be more explicit in linking housing and in particular capital expenditure on housing to specific purpose targets?
Absolutely. That, I think, was part of the question of the previous speaker, and I think that part about it being a bit more explicit, making it kind of easier for people to understand. Will it result in more comments? I'm not sure, but I think we should at least make it easy for people to see the links and to form their opinions about that.
I think something else that would encourage is, whilst we understand with the overriding purpose in terms of the economy, that's probably top of the list in how much economic activity does housing generate. But it is right and appropriate that those other issues about health, education, reduction of crime and antisocial behaviour through good housing provision and management are still keep their role there. I'll give you an example of that. There's an interest, there's a growing interest, for example, amongst councils and housing associations about using at least a modest part of the grant that they have access to make one-off purchases in the private market where it accords with the local housing strategy. The Scottish Government has a nervousness about that because it's not a new unit. It's new supply as such, but it's not a new unit. It doesn't generate the same economic activity. But of course, it may well go a long way to meeting, enabling the local authority to meet housing need. And if you only apply the economic indicator to that rather than the wider indicators, then you're taking perhaps too narrow a look at that provision.
I do think sometimes, though, that there's a disconnect between the work of some of the development agencies, and I'm speaking from experience in the Highlands, where linking in HISE activities in terms of investment in the economy and industry going forward, and then trying to tie in housing provision, which is obviously attractive to inward investors, was a really difficult task, and sometimes not helped by the kind of silo effect, if you like. Housing's nothing really very much to do with us. We're just focusing on industry. So, you know, more joined up thinking and a more kind of holistic approach to the fact that, you know, it's not just about getting the business in, it's about making sure there's housing for the workforce. And, you know, as I say, particularly in areas where there's quite significant inward investment required, but the housing isn't there to accommodate that investment. So that's just a plea I would make.
So should there be a different allocation? Should the money for houses, instead of just being allocated across local authorities, actually follow where the economic activity is?
I think that could be another strand of the budget. I'm not necessarily saying that in terms of affordable or social housing, that shouldn't remain the remit of local authorities working with their housing association partners in terms of delivery. But I think we could do much more imaginative things in terms of you know, economic and housing development and the economy in looking at other financial models in relation to that.
I mean, to some extent, that's a function of the way that you allocate resources at sub-national level and the kinds of weighting and criteria that is used for that. And I guess if an element of that is about affordability, then implicitly it's something to do with pressure in that market, which may be a function, again, of the kind of levels of economic activity that are going there. So I guess the needs-based allocations of across space will to some extent be a reflection of where demand is.
Yeah, to some extent that would be true, but I would agree that you could make a case, and probably should make a case, that at some level that the housing investment should help to support the economy too. So if there are areas of the country where there are jobs but a severe lack of affordable housing provision, then yeah, I would argue that should be a part of a national strategy to make sure that we don't inhibit that kind of economic growth in those areas through a lack of funding for, particularly for affordable housing provision.
Can that be seen? Yes, can the provision in the first place, a bit like a college, people are attracted to, you know, set up businesses next to colleges and universities. So if you've got the infrastructure, is it likely that maybe industry and commerce will follow?
There's a bit of debate in the kind of housing economics literature, amongst other places, which tries to say which comes first. Really, does the location by business follow housing, or does housing follow the business? And I've certainly seen work at a regional UK level, which suggests that good new housing in suburban areas can attract investment into regions. So it can be one of those sources of growth, perhaps.
If you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
And perhaps a national policy should be able to accommodate a bit of both.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Can I move on to another question? It's housing provision and advice on housing around the impacts of changes in the welfare benefits as part of the Scottish Government strategy to mitigate any possible detrimental effects of welfare reform on vulnerable groups. What are your views on how the Scottish Government budget proposals have addressed that particular problem?
Start with that. I think the Scottish Government's gone a long way to looking at how it can support, in the case of from a housing point of view, and that's what I'll comment on, to support tenants and social landlords to do what they can to mitigate the worst impacts, or some of the worst impacts of the reforms. Of course, we only have some of them in place at the moment. From advice, money for advice services, and that's obviously both for independent voluntary organisations and for a tranche of that money has recently been announced for social landlords. A number of national housing bodies are receiving some money to provide, for instance, guidance and training to help social landlords cope with the existing changes, prepare for the ones that are yet to come. And more recently, of course, there's been very substantial sums of money going into helping local authorities bolster their discretionary housing payments, predominantly for the under-occupation penalty. And our view is that, for instance, that just to focus on that £20 million announcement recently for discretionary housing payments, that was a very, very significant form of assistance for local authorities who are, of course, as are the affected tenants and social landlords, in a very, very difficult position over the under-occupation penalty. We do have a view that there was that £20 million was a proportionate response, and that to go beyond that is starting to get disproportionate in relation to others, such as people in the private rented sector, who are also badly affected by the cuts, in some cases in a much greater way than even the under-occupation penalty affects people. But nobody's really talking about governments sort of bailing them out or helping them. So for us, there's a need to keep that assistance proportionate, and I think that £20 million, which represents about 40% of the bedroom tax bill, was a proportionate response.
Yeah, and from a local authority housing side, I think the first thing to do is to emphasise just how vital the provision of good advice and information is, particularly for people in council tenancies affected by under-occupancy penalties. It's ironic that the impact of that is obviously to affect that person's income, but it obviously affects council resources as well, in the sense that to make sure that people are protected insofar as we possibly can from the impact of that they understand the importance of sustaining their tenancy. There's a lot of advice and information has to go in there. Many councils are telling me that they are recruiting specialist advice and information staff to do just that, including some councils doing innovative things and bringing across their employability advisors at housing interviews to make sure tenants get that advice in the round. Doesn't just apply, of course, to council tenants, because tenants in the private rented sector need that. And on the surface of it, since you mentioned the budget, it does look from table 911 in the budget that there is a significant increase in welfare expenditure in terms of the Scottish Welfare Fund and mitigation, and David's already mentioned the 20 million to support discretionary housing payments. Shelter in particular have argued that that's not enough, that we need more than that. I think we're grateful for the increase that we have, but that we would issue a plea to government to be responsive, to continue to work with us, because in some ways the worst is yet to happen. We haven't yet seen the impact of universal credit, potentially the worst, and there's a concern that if that's not handled properly, that tenants, when they receive rent direct, may get into difficulties. So we would just have a plea for government to work with us and to help us when resources are required. Councils are seeing big increases in rent arrears, which will impact on their revenues, so there will be the need going forward, I'm sure, for continued revenue support there, and we would just look for government to work with us and help us out in that on a continued basis.
Yes, I'd certainly endorse what Jim has said in terms of the flexibility and the continued willingness to really monitor the situation. We've got parallel issues to do with with rent arrears and increasing concern about the role of housing staff in providing support to try and keep people in tenancies and to keep particularly the so-called bedroom tax arrears under control. So it's a fluid situation, and therefore, as I say, we would want to continually work with government to mitigate against that.
I've been doing some work looking at some of the impacts of the bedroom tax, and even already, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of kind of case study evidence building up of how different organisations are coping, and they're obviously doing a lot of intensive management of the problem, and they're finding out a lot about the tenants who are exposed to the issues. And one of the things that struck me in talking to people is that essentially different kinds of groups are more or less likely to really be under pressure, and there seems to be evidence that people who are in low-income employment still receiving housing benefit are sometimes better able to cope with a 14% reduction in their housing benefit. But there are certain groups which are potentially exposed. I mean, one are people who are on DLA and getting disability, and they face potentially big problems ahead as the support they get changes. But also there seems to be a cluster, particularly of single adult males who are churning a lot in the system and seem to be the least, if they're benefit dependent, are the most exposed and the least able to cope with the kind of problems that they face. And that's not necessarily something that housing landlords can deal with. You know, that's not, in a sense, that goes kind of beyond their remit to some extent.
And there is a debate amongst our members at the moment as to whether to look at changing some of their house build programmes into one-bedroom flats. But then that's just going to skew for future provision, if you like, because obviously, well, I think over the last 10, 15 years, there's been active encouragement by Scottish Government to build two-bedroom flats and not build one-bedroom flats. So there's a severe lack of, as you say, appropriate accommodation for single young adults. But whether the response now is to turn our programmes wholesale into building one-bedroom flats or not, I think that's, as I say, something that's under discussion. So.
Question that maybe it remains unanswered. How do you utilise a finite budget to maintain things that are out with your control that are likely to come over the horizon? You know, I think the comment that Mr. Hayton used was that we haven't seen it all yet, I think he said. So if there's more to come, how do we, you know, how do we gather people together to have dialogue, and you know, how do we, you know, how do we really explain that, you know, that we don't have enough tools in the box, we don't have enough money. I mean, is it possible to continue the way we're going by simply utilising the budget that we've got, which means it's effectively going to have, you know, the money that we've got is to be for schools and colleges and hospitals and all the other things. But if we're using it to as a bulwark against a decision that we don't have the powers for, has there not come a time when we really need to come up with a different answer to it?
There has to be a limit to how much, you know, the Scottish Government can pay for or bail people out of UK government changes, whether that's welfare reform or others. I think a very cost-effective way in which the Scottish Government has chosen to spend some of its mitigation funding is to enable that sharing of information about trying to deal with the worst impacts. So, for example, one of our partner organisations, the Scottish Housing Best Value Network, is now running regular forums for councils, predominantly for councils and housing associations, which will look at, for example, learning the lessons from those pilots that have been in existence for the last year or so on direct payments. So, you know, helping landlords to help look ahead and help people to have a range of rent payment methods, for instance, so that under direct payments, that the arrears loss the arrears build up is minimised as much as possible. A lot of that is about information sharing, which can go a long way to help minimise some of that damage, and that's pretty cost-effective use of resources, rather than in a sense, looking at the other end of the scale at using big money to simply try and nullify the changes. It's got to be a balance of those two approaches.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I sit in a whole range, or take part in a whole range of different groups related to welfare reform, and it does seem that there's a fair degree of consensus amongst, if I can call it, Civic Scotland about the nature of the problem, albeit that we're still at the fairly early stages. I mean, these changes came in April this year, and what councils all over the land and their counterparts in housing associations too will be doing is trying to make sense of this and trying to work out what the medium and the long-term impact of this might be. So we know, our councils will know what's happened to their revenues since April. They'll be asking the question, how much of that rent that may have been lost is likely to be recoverable. They'll be asking what they need to be doing to get tenants ready for the next stage in terms of universal credit, making sure that they have bank accounts of some kind, about the importance of budgeting and, as I said earlier, maybe advising about employment. They will be doing all of that. And Scottish Government are constructing a kind of wider framework to try and enable us all to see what are the impacts on service as a result of the potential revenue reductions, and looking at potential solutions. You know, some councils might have the headroom, if you like, to put up rents to cope, although that brings its own problems, because if you put up the rent of someone who's facing a 14% reduction in their housing benefit, you create a bigger problem. But they will be looking at all that in the round. I don't think we're quite at the stage yet where we can add all of that up and effectively present not the bill, but present the outcomes of that to government and say, here's absolutely the magnitude of the problem we have. COSLA have made a decent effort and made some estimates about what the different elements of the reforms might do. But I think we have to keep our eye closely on that and go back to my earlier point about staying close to Scottish Government, keeping Government advised on what we think the impact might be, doing what we can to help ourselves, of course, but trying to establish that kind of big picture on national level, so that allows elected politicians opportunities to make judgments about priorities that in the same way that they would do in councils.
I think we've all learnt a lot from the Dunedin Canmore pilot for the DWP, which in a sense gave us heads up early on some of the issues that we expected to see in terms of profile of tenants and arrears issues and the almost automatic increases that, as I say, were expected. But it goes back to the sector itself and local authorities basically girding themselves up to complement the direct cash that could be applied for under discretionary payments, that see almost a whole other side of their activity in terms of support of tenants and prevention of issues at an early stage. And as I say, that's a contribution in a sense can't necessarily be measured by money, but must be a huge part of the mitigation of the welfare reform measures.
The intensive management that has been going on for the last 18 months or so amongst housing associations and councils, I guess one of the things that it does, it has a huge opportunity cost. It means you're less able to do other things, obviously, but what it does do is in a sense, the bedroom tax issue becomes a kind of pilot for the next round of welfare reform. So there's much more information now about which tenants are vulnerable, about what things you have to do, what options they face, how their behaviour might change as a result of these things. And that's obviously going to be tremendously valuable going forward.
Okay, thanks very much for that.
Mary, do you want to come?
Yes, thank you, Convener. The 2014-15 housing supply budget contains an apparent uplift between 2013-14 and 14-15. And there are many pressures on the Scottish Government and there are calls for expenditure of both capital and revenue to address specific issues. Do the panel think that the resource allocation is correct? And is it targeted in the right way? And will it be sufficient to achieve its purposes?
We've tended to look at because of the funding of the spending round covers a 3-year period. We tended to analyse the budget on a 3-year basis rather than necessarily look at individual years. And of course, the way you fund house building, the way the government funds house building, lends itself to looking at a longer term period, because obviously a house is approved and goes on site, it may not be finished for a year or more thereafter. I think our feeling, both on 14-15 specifically, but perhaps more appropriately on the 3-year round, is that it had a bad start and started from a very low level where we all expected cuts, given what was happening in the sort of national and global economy, but that housing did seem to take a disproportionate hit based on as compared with the overall hit on the Scottish Government's capital budget. But a lot of that damage, and you're comparing £630 million or so in the original 3-year budget with what's now 970. And that does mean that a lot of that initial damage, that disproportionate cut, has really been addressed in a way which now provides a solid basis going forward. And of course, although the 15-16 outline budget is not the subject specifically of the committee's deliberations now, that outline budget does sustain and build on the average amount of funding that's been available in the current 3-year round. So whilst we would all like to see even more to enable perhaps government eventually to go beyond its current targets, it is a good news story if you compare what's in the budget for these current 3 years up till March 2015 compared with what was in that budget a couple of years when it was first announced a couple of years ago.
I think from my perspective, I mean, you asked, I think, 3 questions. Is the allocation correct? Is it targeted, and will it achieve its purpose? I mean, it probably won't surprise the committee to hear that as a housing professional, I would like to see much more money being invested in housing. We have still have a big housing shortage in Scotland, and we really need to address that. But we were extremely disheartened a few years ago when housing, we thought, had suffered a disproportionate cut, 40% cut. So we're equally glad to see that a lot of that has been restored, and we've gone for from some 638 to about 970 million. Indeed, I think Ken makes the point in his paper that housing's had the biggest real terms increase of any other budget heading. So we greatly welcome that. Is it targeted? It should be, because effectively affordable housing is a consequence of work done by local authorities and their partners on the priorities locally about local housing needs. So one would hope that local authorities and their partners in housing association, the private sector, know best about what's needed. And does it achieve its purpose? I would argue that it does, that we build now to very high standards, including energy efficiency. But I think that's an overall question about our ability to evaluate the effectiveness of the programme. I think, as we've already said, there's some improvements can be made there, but I'll finish by saying what I said earlier. It's difficult for me at any rate to think of a better investment nationally than good quality housing for people who need it.
What the budget's done and going forward, and also the changes to subsidy levels that were announced in July, has really put confidence back into the sector. And what we're finding is that whereas people were laying off development staff and really seeing their whole build programme grinding to a halt, they're now moving forward with more confidence. They're looking at feasibilities. They're actually more able to engage with the private sector in terms of following through Section 75 commitments, for instance, on mixed tenure projects. So rather than the situation that there was maybe a year ago where they just had to say, I'm sorry, we can't partner, we can't collaborate because the funding isn't there, we're now finding much more opportunities to, as I say, work with our local authority partners, private sector partners, and actually begin to deliver housing supply, which is what we need. but it's, you know, it has made a huge difference. And as Jim has said, we're not back to the levels we were at. We always want more, but what we want to show you is what we're able to do with what you've given us and the confidence that you've put back into the sector. And I think that's a great thing.
Last year in this committee, one of the things that was identified was financial capacity and the problems of particularly the relationship between housing associations and private finance. And I think several of the papers you've got identified continuing kind of market failure issues around capacity for private finance. So turning the grant levels round and in a sense reinforcing that by increasing the overall programme to kind of accommodate that increase in grant is a really effective way of overcoming at the margin some of these issues with private finance. I think everybody says this has made a really important difference to for the willingness and ability of social providers to actually go in and build. So I think it has been an important.
Of course, one of the criticisms of the budget, particularly from Audit Scotland, is how complicated housing budgets are and how difficult they are to actually track and properly scrutinise. And of course, Audit Scotland are right when they point out, and has been pointed out by the witnesses, that housing did take a disproportionate cut initially, and money has been added into that to kind of level off your playing field, although there was the cut initially. So I just wondered if you agreed around the comments that have been made around the budget, that it's very, very difficult to track where the money is. And also there's been a comment made that it will be 20 years before enough new homes are built. And the final kind of small question I would like to ask, if I may, do you think it would be beneficial if there was a 10-year strategy for housing, and you could track and plan over a 10-year period rather than the short 3-year period for your funding?
Maybe on that last point, there may well be there'll be periods where you'd be grateful for 3 years because we're looking at 15, 16 for reasons I don't think that the Scottish Government can be held responsible for, of a single year there almost before hopefully we then go into another longer period. But I mean, my guess, and I'm sure Jim and other colleagues will say that if you can provide programmes of lengths of the sort you've described, which means programmes that go obviously beyond one or more governments, then that's going to be that's terrific in terms of long-term planning. The point, sorry, your first point, I was going. Yes, I mean, you're right to highlight. Audit Scotland highlighted this, and there are a number of complexities which perhaps other budgets don't have, and looking, for instance, at outlined spending plans under the housing heading won't include the money, for instance, that Glasgow and Edinburgh get for housing supply, which is under the local government settlement. So you've immediately got figures that need putting together from different parts of the budget, and there is that I think we all think that there's scope for the Scottish Government to set out more clearly on its website, for example, in a way that anyone can access exactly what is in the Scottish housing budget. And of course, if we look at the last couple of years, there have been a lot of very welcome additions through Barnett Consequentials, etc., which have taken some effort to track. And it's kind of been good news, but it's not very obvious to see that good news some way. So there is certainly scope for that. I think what would be even more challenging, but again it's a challenge that we throw to the Scottish Government, is to track nationally how that money is being spent, and that really does have challenges because of the lag, if you like, in the programme about money that. Money that's spent in, how much money can be spent in year and how much money, in a sense, are you looking, if you start building a house now, you're going to pay out on that later. Although the recent commitment Scottish Government's made to make staged payments, so it's not all payment at the end, that certainly that helps keep the budget moving, if you like. But it is complex, and there has to be scope for some better more accountable information on the budget and how it's progressing.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
If you don't, that's fine.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to mention the split between grant and loan and equity, because I think during the course of the budget we kept hearing there was additional loan and equity money being made available, which of course it won't necessarily support social housing building, but may be used for things like shared equity and National Housing Trust and whatever. And that's always been quite confusing as to how that's actually being applied. So I would just plea for more clarity on that.
Okay, if we can move on, Alex.
Okay, I'll try and rattle through the more specific questions quickly. The first one is, housing, of course, has a major role in achieving climate change targets. To what extent do witnesses think the housing budget supports the provision of sustainable greener homes?
Within the grant system, there's a premium grant that can be applied for where housing associations are putting in additional renewable features, which the majority of them do take advantage of, because obviously they're working towards not only the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, but there's the new environmental standards for public housing that are about to be introduced as well. So I think housing associations, in a sense, have been a flagship, along with our local authority colleagues, in terms of building new housing, which meets the carbon agenda and is looking towards... and there's two strands of that. One's fuel poverty, because obviously if you're able to make energy efficient houses, your tenants are going to find them all the more comfortable and cheaper to live in and use. So it's in our interests, if you like, to make sure we are building to standards. But I think you'll find at every level we've embraced that agenda, and it's something that we fought for in terms of, even when grants were tighter, looking at making sure we were still building good quality sustainable homes.
But before we hear from other people, that answer almost gives the impression that housing associations and local authorities, of course, have been taking the lead on this. Have the government been giving you enough encouragement?
Well, as I say, I think through the fact that there's additional grant well, there's two things. One is the setting of standards, which clearly, if we're measured by those standards, it's something that we want to achieve anyway, but there's standards that we have to meet. So in terms of regulation and guidance and standards, that's one thing to aim for, if you like. But as I say, the fact that the grant levels do encourage additional features, and indeed more grant is paid for those additional features, I think is hugely helpful and supportive. I mean, that there's still an issue going forward about as standards increase, are those levels enough to truly support where we want to go to in terms of zero carbon and 2020 emission targets, etc. But it's about working closely and providing you with evidence, basically, as to where we're going with all of that.
Shall I go next? Maybe start with the obvious point that the biggest challenge, I think, for us in energy efficiency of our housing stock is clearly existing houses, because the new housing stock only adds a small percentage each year, and I think we're getting pretty good at identifying how to build new houses to that standard. But if I think about our existing stock and try to answer your question about whether housing budgets support the green agenda, it's not just the green agenda, of course, it's the equally pressing social issue about fuel costs and fuel poverty. And we're working very closely with government, and I almost say a number of acronyms, EASH, HEAPS and REAPS. EASH being the energy efficiency standard for social housing, where we're expected, our local authorities and our housing association counterparts are expected to improve all of our housing to a kind of minimal energy efficiency standard by 2020, with a much bigger step change by 2050. And some of us have been working very closely with government under the context of the sustainable housing strategy to work in pilot projects and to try and arrive at kind of specimen costs about what it might cost to reach that 2020 standard for basic council house types. And again, we do have the issue about resources, and we've said to government, of course we're committed to the standard. We have some concerns about the extent to which the utilities and the energy companies will be able to fulfil their obligations, but we're absolutely committed to getting our own housing stock up to that standard, and as I say, not least for the benefit of people who are paying exorbitant sums in fuel costs, and every price hike amplifies that. We've got the HEAP scheme, which is much more about mixed tenure estates, and again, a lot of work involved with local authorities and more money going into that. And finally, we've got REITs, which is energy efficiency standards for the private sector, which we're just talking just now about regulations. So I'll be very brief, but I think we're starting to get our ducks in a row in terms of what the strategy should look like. We're getting a handle on the technical aspects of things that we can do to get our houses up to a minimum standard. I don't think it's possible yet to say, do we have all the money in place? I don't think we have, but I think we work on the basis that if we think this is important about reducing carbon, reducing fuel poverty, then the resources will be made available. I know COSLA have been emphasising fairly strongly that they'll sign up to EISH on the basis that to the extent that utility companies can't keep their side of the bargain, we would need some help from government to do that.
I don't have anything to add.
Just to say that I think the longer term challenge in relation to central government funding in relation to energy efficiency is probably going to come from the introduction or the expected introduction of minimum standards of energy efficiency for private owners, which we expect to see that ball start rolling in around 2015 for implementation for full implementation a few years later. That the extent to which government provides carrots, if you like, incentives for homeowners, perhaps in a way that doesn't necessarily involve throwing grant. It's very hard in the current economic climate to justify throwing grant at homeowners who will ultimately benefit from that in terms of their property value. But there is a challenge there to look at, for government, for instance, to look at whether to reinvigorate the exploration it was embarking upon a few years ago before the credit crunch of having some kind of national lending unit that supports local authorities with their schemes of assistance to try and help owners get, for instance, equity loans that have to be paid back on sale of the property, but that don't involve interest payments. Something that really would make a difference for homeowners they've got their asset, they've got their property, but they don't necessarily have a lot of income. That's a big question for government. How far can they go in the future to funding support for homeowners, even if it's some kind of recycling loan fund? It will need funding in the first instance. So I think those challenges for the existing stock remain to be addressed.
Just one final point about EU structural funds and using ERDF funding for making renewable improvements to existing housing. I think in Wales and France, they've been able to use these funds to great effect on specific projects in particular areas. And I think certainly in the paper that we submitted to the committee, we were asking government to look at whether a similar proportion of funds could be used in Scotland as part of your use of structural funds, which I think you're looking at the moment in terms of 2014 going forward. So as I say, there is a precedent there. It's certainly allowable under EU rules, and it's something that would give a boost to the existing homes argument that both Jim and David have referred to.
Maybe one final point from me, Chair. It's akin to the point that was made on the different elements of the affordable housing budget. I do hear a lot of colleagues in councils and elsewhere saying that we could simplify the language and maybe some of the acronyms around this agenda too. It's quite complicated. I've probably succeeded only in muddying the waters further with these acronyms. But I think it is quite difficult and perhaps too for consumers to see their way quite clearly into the kind of maze of the funding that is available and how they access that. I accept that's not just an issue for government, but we need to, I think, work together just to simplify that for people, to let them know precisely what carrots, as well as the ultimate sticks, might be coming ahead in the future. And that's part of the work that is ongoing with some of the working groups that I mentioned, but there is a need for clarity there.
Okay. On a different subject, the National Indicator for Improving Access to suitable housing options for those in housing need is very specific and measured by the percentage of homeless households that are entitled to settled accommodation. What do the witnesses think of this measure, and whether as an indicator it's still appropriate?
I'll maybe start this time. It seems to me to be very narrow. I think that was the indication we were talking about earlier. I would have thought having a broader general measure of housing need in total would be more effective, one that tries to take account of affordability-based need, specific forms of vulnerable need, all of those things, rather than just one. It seems odd to have one partial dimension when we all recognise it's a much broader problem, and look at the extent to which we're meeting that broader problem. Now, the issue in a sense is that, as I said in my written evidence, that we haven't really had a national measure of that kind since 2005, really. So I think it's long overdue that we had some kind of national estimate which broke down into those different elements.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think we've probably been preoccupied, perhaps quite legitimately, over the last few years with homelessness in particular, as we move towards some fairly challenging legislation that said everyone who was homeless should be entitled to settled accommodation by the end of last year. And I think it is time for another look at the indicators and finding not losing track of homelessness, because it is the most basic indicator of housing need, but finding, as Ken's alluded to, perhaps a more sophisticated way of measuring both the problem and our success at dealing with it.
So in a sense, just numbers don't really say anything about whether a person actually has improved access to suitable housing. It's just saying the homelessness figures have gone down. So I would endorse the need for it to be much more informative than it is.
So would it be fair to say the previous indicator has done its job and it's time to look for something that tells us more about what's going on now?
Yes, I would say so.
Thank you.
Mark?
Thank you. Professor Gibb already alluded to concerns about the financial capacity of the social housing sector to invest in new homes, and that's on a backdrop, against the backdrop of welfare reform and the impact that's had on increased costs on covering rent arrears and lost income. And anecdotally, I've heard, and I think other colleagues have heard, from housing associations who've had difficulties with banking institutions and their ability to borrow money to fund investment and reprofiling of existing debts. And just on that backdrop of the financial capacity, do you think the housing sector will be able to meet its targets for new homes that have been set down by the government?
I think, Professor Gibb, you said that the increase in grant has proved to be a way of saying to banks, well, we're now really over 50% of the capital cost, and they're a bit more comfortable about some of the changes that are going forward. But the biggest problem for the banks, as far as we're aware, is the previous loans they've made to housing associations, which were done at a time when the margins that they charged weren't really commercial, and they're now sort of saying, I think somebody said to me 60% of all loans there was issues with. So what they've been trying to do going forward is, yes, we'll lend you more money, but we'll have to reprice your existing loans, and there's a huge financial burden placed on associations, and that has prevented many of them from looking to move forward. But our approach has been basically to enter into a dialogue with banks to sort of say, it can't remain like this. OK, you've got this issue, you've got this problem, but we have to find some way around that, whether that's setting up new financial structures, whether it's looking at other sources of finance, whether that's coming clean about the problem, if you like, and trying to find a way through it with either government support or whatever. It has to be addressed, because you're right, ultimately it may prevent some providers from providing housing in areas where there's need, so that grant allocations in a sense aren't being made on a provider in an area that's building housing because that's their remit to do that, but simply on financial capacity and ability to build, which, as I say, might present quite a different pattern of Scotland in terms of housing provision. So it's an ongoing dialogue, but I don't think it will be addressed by us not confronting the banks and not trying to call them to account, and not by trying to sort of say, if you have this issue, we have to work through this. And I know not only ourselves, but also Scottish Government colleagues are looking at that approach as well, and hoping that, as I say, the increased grant, in a sense, gives them a bit more comfort and less reason, perhaps, to be as punitive as they have been on our members.
Yeah, for my part, councils are clearly funded in a different way from RSL, so don't quite have the complexity of problems. The key problem for councils is just maintaining some kind of revenue surplus, because it's these surpluses that councils tend to use to reinvest, either in their existing stock to meet the quality standard by 2015, and more recently to fund new build council housing. But it's already been mentioned, the extra £16,000 per unit available to councils will help greatly there. And I would be cautiously optimistic that the councils would do their bit to meet their part of the target for the, I think it's 6,000 a year, isn't it, and 4,000 of those being social. But we monitor it, we keep doing that, but the 16k extra will certainly help that objective.
I guess 2 points I would make. One is that because there's a problem with traditional banking finance, as you suggested, for housing associations, people clearly look for alternatives, and alternatives spring up, competition appears, so you get opportunities in bond markets and capital markets. And that's okay. If you're a big housing association, you can access bond finance. If you're a smaller association, you might be able to do something on a syndicated basis with other smaller people seeking smaller amounts of funds. But I think they're, in different ways, they're quite immature kind of market developments. And there's clearly gaps, still big gaps in associations which, for different reasons, can't really access either route into the capital market. And they don't really want to take on the kinds of bank finance and the terms and conditions that it's being offered, as you indicated. So, and it kind of relates to something that one of my colleagues said earlier. We don't really know enough, I don't think, about the effectiveness of the delivery of programmes as they happen. So one of the questions that I've always got is, to what extent are associations who've got approvals in the system actually going to develop when the time comes when they have to make that decision? And we don't often know exactly how many are actually going to deliver what we think few months beforehand we thought they were going to deliver. And certainly anecdotal evidence of different parts of the country where there are less people developing than we thought there were a year, or going to develop than we thought there were a year ago. And that's partly about this financial question and this kind of market failure or gap in the system. But I have no sense at all of how significant or how quantitatively big that is in terms of actually delivering the target. It's very hard to say, but it is a concern.
Just to come back on a point that Mr. Torrance made, you said that all the members of the panel have welcomed the £16,000 increase, and that it will go some way towards positive discussions with banks. Are there any particular housing associations where that £16,000 increase simply won't be enough to get them around the discussions that they are having over their existing commitments?
I don't think that will be the issue in terms of the 16 grand, if you see what I mean. I think it will be particular circumstances to do with that association, level of cover, maybe their exposure as far as the bank's credit committee is concerned. So, as I say, I don't necessarily think the level of grant is what is going to be the blockage. And you know, the one thing I find when I talk to members is every member's situation is different. Every member's relationship almost with their lenders is different, and it's trying to. One thing I've been quite keen to try and do is try and agree some sort of protocol with the banks, i.e. this is how housing associations will be treated in terms of like repricing, in terms of looking at business going forward, so people have a clear view that they're not being picked off individually by their lenders. But there is a sea change, and it's a sea change just in the last couple of months, I would say, and that probably reflects the general pickup in the economy. And certainly there's a number of banks coming to us and saying, we're open for business, we were never not open for business, and you know, they're talking about 15-year money now, for instance, which is a big improvement on what there was even just 12 months ago. So it goes back to some of the earlier comments we've all made about things being very fluid and about us being as proactive as possible and trying to secure opportunities. And you're right to a certain extent about looking at alternatives. And, you know, both ourselves and Scottish Government have put a lot of energy into bonds, potential borrowing from European Bank, taking advantage of UK government guarantees, etc., etc. But, you know, it does come back to the scale of some of the developments that we're looking at and what works in a Scottish context. And I do think we are quite different from some of the big housing association deals that have been seen in England.
I would also just add to Susan's comments there that by nature, for reasons of obvious parity, the 16,000 increase was across the board, both in terms of councils and housing associations and in terms of location. There are bound to be parts of Scotland where the costs of building are much greater than in other parts. And so whilst we've all warmly welcomed the grant increase, it doesn't mean to say that for instance, associations in Edinburgh or other particular hotspots have had the whole problem solved. It obviously helps a lot, but it may well be that it doesn't completely solve the issue for associations in higher price areas, higher cost areas. Yeah.
Thank you. If I can move on to the privately owned sector and talk about the Help to Buy Scotland scheme. Can I ask members of the panel if they think that will have overall a positive impact in house building in Scotland, and ask also if there's a potential knock-on effect that because incentives are being offered to first buyers and people who are moving up the property ladder, that they are so focused on new builds because of the incentives that there's a negative impact on existing house prices?
I'll start, if I may. I think there's seems to be a lot of support for the notion that if this policy exists, it ought to be focused at new build rather than the existing market as it is in England. There's a lot of people worried about speculative activity that might flow from this in the English case. We've now got, you know, historically low levels of house building in Scotland, and they've been going down for quite a long period of time. So that, in a sense, helps the industry in an important way. On the other hand, the ceiling of £400,000 for Help to Buy 2 is very high. I mean, that's nearly twice the level of the average new build house in Scotland last year, which suggests that, you know, it's not necessarily going to be helping affordability or helping people getting into the housing market. There's going to be, in some sense, you know, the targeting certainly raises questions about the targeting of it. But I think to the extent that it should make a significant dent in the house building sector, that's got to be a positive and helpful thing.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Ken on that one. I think I agree too that it's helpful that in Scotland it's focused on the new build sector, so it should give that boost that we all agree, I think, is really needed to our construction sector. And I think it's worth trying. It's worth trying it, seeing how it does, what the take up is, the impact it has on it, all the while keeping an eye on the outcomes and the house prices. I don't think it's likely to have a huge impact in house prices or create a housing bubble the way it might do in an overheated market like the southeast of England.
I think there's a monitoring board, is it the CML and Homes for Scotland are actually overseeing and reporting on issues such as, you know, is it increasing supply or is it increasing prices? Because that would be the concern, that that might be the effect rather than necessarily a huge boost to house building. But certainly as far as our members are concerned, there are a number of private sector sites where they've got a Section 75 interest in delivering housing, and if it enables the private sector to have the confidence to build and, you know, the affordable housing follows on as a result of that, infrastructure is in place, then I think that's a good thing and to be welcomed.
Thanks for that. Gordon.
Thanks, Convener. The budget document states that efficiency savings of 3% are expected across the board from 2013-14 to 2015-16. How feasible is it, in your opinion, for Scottish Government agencies, local authorities and other public bodies in the housing area to continue to achieve ongoing and cumulative savings of 3% per annum?
The short answer to that has to be very difficult indeed. I mean, I'm only out of local government a couple of years, and I remember 5 or 6 years ago, even though housing budget was ring-fenced in the sense that the money came in from rents, the council took the view that the same kind of financial discipline should be applied to housing, and it was a reasonable case to make that housing should be putting its house in order with efficiencies the same as other departments in the council. But I remember even 3 or 4 years ago it becoming increasingly difficult. So by definition, at a time when income to local authorities certainly hasn't been rising, it's got to get more and more difficult. So I would say very challenging indeed to deliver that cumulative 3% that you've mentioned.
We've talked about how housing association resources are being diverted towards the welfare reform agenda in terms of increasing support to tenants, but also the other side of that, and potentially increasing rent arrears and more cost. So I think remaining neutral would be a good outcome, if you like, in the current climate. But it's not that associations aren't looking at procurement initiatives or ways of collaborating in order to reduce costs. But again, the diversity of the sector sometimes means that's not as easy as it potentially is for local authorities to collaborate under the procurement reform agenda. So that's something that we're working with our members on.
I mean, what do you think the long-term effect would be if this 3% is maintained?
From a local authority perspective, it depends on whether that 3% is communicated to housing departments. The way local authorities are structured, of course, the funding tends to be in 2 big pots, the general fund for education, social work, and the housing revenue account. Not all local authorities will impose or will have to impose that 3%, and it's more likely to affect, I think, the general fund. But the general fund also does some important things in a housing sense, aids and adaptations. For example, there's quite often a contribution to homelessness. And I think the outcome may, at the risk of stating the obvious, might have to be cuts at some point where councils would just have to say, well, we have to cut our cloth accordingly. There's going to be certain things that we can no longer do. Councils are already doing this, of course, and just more of the same in terms of having to cut services. And some people might argue that anything that could be cut, that's already happened to, so we might be getting to the stage of having to look at statutory services and other things that hitherto we would have regarded as pretty sacrosanct. So apologies that that's a wee bit woolly, but I think very tough, I think, is the answer to your question.
And moving on to the budget process itself, delivery of the national indicators specifically linked to housing and the contribution of housing to the purpose targets is through a mix of national and local government, private and third sector. How involved do you feel in the strategy settings, budget allocations, planning and delivery of the budget?
Interesting question.
Not a huge amount.
Our silence, probably.
That again, it might happen. It might happen in other areas. It might be much more of a function of the directors of finance via COSLA or something like that. But speaking specifically for me in a housing sense, and what I recall as my previous role as a director of housing, one of Scotland's larger councils, not involved to a great extent.
Okay, thanks so much.
Adam?
Yes, can we go back to an earlier discussion we had on preventative spend? There's been an increase of £4 million to £10 million in the budget for adaptations. And this is an example, obviously, of potential preventative spending with possible lower health and social care expenditure resulting. do you have views on the analysis around preventative spend in the housing sector and on the amount allocated in the budget?
I think £10 million is welcome, but I'm looking forward to the work of the adaptations group that's been set up to implement the report that came out last December about making more sense of the adaptation system, whereby we've got different procedures for housing associations, local authorities, and indeed the whole issue of the private sector and their access to adaptations funding and what differences that might make in terms of preventative spend. So I think that it's a good holding position, but I think that, as I say, the outcome of the work of the group and the implementation of the report is the important side of this, to get a proper system in place to then to be able to demonstrate how national performance targets are being met through this measure.
My understanding is that preventative spending is currently specifically identified in the Scottish Government budget only in respect of the change funds. Now, do you have views on whether, and if so, how other types of spend with preventative outcomes might be labelled, and how any resulting savings in revenue expenditure might be identified and assigned?
I would start by commenting that there was a time when there were certain strands of funding that, because they were separately identified and ring-fenced, there was a chance of tracking expenditure. So, for instance, the former supporting people funding was one way. It's not by no means the whole picture, because the whole strand of care funding as well, of course, that is layered on top of that for people with greater care needs. But most of those previously separate budgets are now part of the local government block, and my sense is that it is much harder to track preventative spend unless it has a label like as you've identified, the change fund. But within that block of revenue, that sort of quite to some degree hidden world of revenue funding within local authorities, I think preventative spend, certainly in the housing support context, is much harder to track, let alone the impact of it. Just to track the spend at all, it feels a lot more difficult once you have lost a ring-fence budget.
I think it's a complex area. I know, and it's very difficult to establish cause and effect. If you invest a pound in housing, that it might save you a multiplier of that in some other area, like reducing acute hospital costs, emergency admissions or whatever. But I think we need to get better at it. I mean, I did some work a wee while ago looking at aids and adaptations throughout Scotland, and whereas the budgets used to be ring-fenced, and after the Concordat was negotiated with COSLA, that was removed. What that's meant that there's an inconsistent pattern of provision of aids and adaptations now throughout Scotland, and no particular correlation with the size of a budget and, let's say, the size of an elderly population in an area. And I think that's something that we need to look at in the group that Scottish Government have just reconvened, that Susan mentioned. This adaptations group, I think, needs to look at that. I think we could benefit from the housing options approach that we've used to get homelessness applications down, where local authorities or whoever act as kind of advisory and signposting agencies, such that it doesn't matter which area that you live in, or even more important, which tenure that you live in, because by and large, if you're a council or a housing association tenant, you will probably get that adaptation provided pretty quickly. Whereas if you own your own home and are elderly and need something, or probably at the bottom end of the scale, a private rented tenant, it's much more difficult to access that advice and information. But I think we can say with some degree of certainty that if we can invest in those kind of areas, future-proof older people's homes, against the need for bigger investments in the future, which some councils have done as part of their improvements to the housing quality standard. While they've been fitting kitchens and bathrooms, they've been fitting appropriate showers and grab rails for people. Now, if that can stop an older person falling and having a long term in hospital, then great. But we probably do have a bit more work to do in establishing that absolute cause and effect. But it's hard for me to think of a bit of housing investment that isn't some way preventative. You know, you fix the tile in the roof, you stop the need for a new roof. So I do think it's an area that we need to make much more of. How we then actually demonstrate to government that they should be taking money from, let's say, the health budget and giving it to housing to invest at the front end, of course, is a much more difficult issue, knowing the political and other sensitivities that are around health expenditure. But we in the housing sector need to work harder at that.
I was going to add that I think the promotion issue, the promotion of useful things that housing expenditure does, needs to be labelled in a kind of proactive way. I was just thinking about, in the context of the private rented strategy that's recently been developed, there's obviously a large number of local authority officers and other people are working hard to think about how to police and regulate the bottom end of the private rented sector, which, in terms of dispute resolution, other things like that, which must in a sense save a lot of money further down the line if it's done effectively. But how does one capture that? It's quite a tricky thing to do.
All right. I was going to come back to you, David, on what you said about climate change and insulation measures help increase the value of a house. In fact, it doesn't, because we haven't got the Institute of Chartered Surveyors or lawyers selling houses, and behaviour change far enough along the roads for that to happen. But in terms of the national indicator of increasing the number of new homes, I mean, there is a very specific target for new completions by the 31st of March 2015. You know, just as a final thing, is that going to be achieved? And maybe just a further quick one is, should the information on the Scotland Performs web page be more specific in terms of using strategies and budgets and subordinate indicators, or is it better to just keep it fairly simple?
First, on the your point about the target by 2015, I think there's been a lag. Some of the problems that have been alluded to by colleagues today about the period before the grant rates increase and when there was uncertainty also about the overall funding pot have certainly led to a lag, in a delay in terms of now getting the programme moving. So there is a possibility that there might be a dip, possibly, looking at completions, certainly this year, completions in 14-15 possibly will fall below. What one would have to hope then that was made up for in 15-16 and beyond, which is of course going beyond the 5-year period that the 30,000 target was set out for. So I think there's some catching up needed, and I think we're all hoping that catching up can be done.
Anyone else got any final comment?
You're asking, Chair, you're making me very nervous, because you're asking me if the target will be achieved, and the clerk advises beforehand that everything's recorded verbatim.
Yes.
And I think you mean the target of 30,000 new affordable homes in the lifetime of the Parliament. I would use the phrase that I used earlier, which would be cautiously optimistic, on the basis that you promise not to bring us back if we get it wrong and hold us to account.
And I know the Housing Minister is very determined anyway that it will be achieved.
As are we.
Yes, as is everybody, I think.
Certainly had evidence of approvals that are now proceeding because of the new grant rates, whereas the projects were stuck before. So capturing that is good.
Well, that's a very good optimistic note to end on. Thank you all very much for your evidence today. It's been most helpful in our deliberations. Thank you very much. And I'll suspend briefly. Well, actually, we're going into private anyway, so conclude the public part of this session.